So chamomile is nice because it not only acts as an anxiolytic and helps with the stress driven fight or flight factor behind that digestive experience, but it also acts as a bit of a digestive bitter. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 anti anxiety digestive bitter, super cheap, super easy remedy.
I do want to maybe start on the thread of mood and what herbs you found to be most impactful for mood and maybe share with us some of the mechanisms of actions through which they improve things like depression or anxiety or what have you.
Absolutely. So the first herb that comes to mind for mood is definitely St. John's wort. I think this is one that many people are familiar with, and you might even be able to find in your local CVS, unfortunately, through a brand like Nature Made, who's probably not harvesting it correctly. This is a plant that really blooms and starts to flower in a very short period around the summer solstice. And it's this very special experience where this plant is storing so much energy in its roots and its leaves before it finally comes out to flower. And then it expresses through this really beautiful, solar, yellow, happy flower. And that's kind of what we talk about in traditional herbalism as the doctrine of signatures, where part of the plant's actual physical presentation can give us clues as to how this plant may work. This plant blooms at essentially the maximum solar part of the year where we have the most sun and light energy in the environment. As we harvest that plant and create tinctures for the winter months, we're able to kind of save and later impart some of that solar energy within to our psyche when it comes time for seasonal affective disorder. What that looks like in an actual scientific Western lens is that we know that St. John's wort may actually modulate and improve serotonin, for example. It may modulate GABA receptors and dopamine levels. It may help to lower inflammation, actually, that's coming from our gut, our digestive system, in order to modulate neuroinflammation via the gut brain axis. It may also help to upregulate certain liver detoxification pathways like cytochrome P450 in order to help us become more astute when it comes to eliminating excess hormones and toxicants from the environment, which of course would play a role in our overall inflammatory load and oxidative stress and thus our
Mhm.
mood. So that's one example where tradition tends to translate to science many years later.
Sketch the avatar of what the person presents like for whom you feel St. John's wort is the most indicated.
Yeah, this is someone who's going to have a really marked appearance of seasonal affective disorder every year, where as soon as the sun comes out, their mood is changing so drastically within that day or so that you're like, oh, yeah, this is a person who really needs the sun, who needs that solar energy. It's also going to be a person who tends to have some frazzled nerves. They're going to be hypersensitive to stress. And another preparation in terms of how we use St. John's wort in the herbal world is that we will infuse St. John's wort flowers into some kind of an oil using heat and thyme. And we'll use that oil topically to kind of help coat and soothe and ground the nerves when someone is experiencing periods of increased stress. So this will be a person who's very frazzled, who is just very melancholic. They kind of just have this dark perspective of the world that again needs that boost of light even within their psyche and their perspective. And they're also often people who deal with some degree of chronic pain. That's part of the indication. They're not only having periods of low mood and cycles of low mood, but they're also having cycles of inflammation driven pain that comes and goes.
Gotcha. So it's not necessarily someone who has depression sort of all the time and they're looking at St. John's wort as like popping a pill that's a natural antidepressant. You think there needs to be more of this sort of seasonality to that presentation.
I think that is probably the most helpful way because I also find that it's a good practice to cycle it. I think that with any kind of mood and serotonin modulating herb, you also don't want to, again, like try to push things too far, create some of that dependence. So it is good to cycle on and off of it and use it seasonally. But I have seen cases where this is helpful for someone who just has, more of like a picture of generalized depression
Right.
and needs a tool for a period of, let's say, like 3 to 4 months or even more to really shift that pattern and shift not only their mindset, but their habits enough to where then their habits start to pick up the work of lowering that inflammation and modulating those brain chemicals.
By the way, if this has been helpful, please subscribe, comment and share this with one person you think it might help. Let's double click on anxiety because I'd love to hear what either herb or formula you like to use for anxiety. Yeah, St. John's wort, I don't think it's super effective. I could be wrong. I remember doing a brief poke. And for depression, there's some interesting information, but there wasn't the carryover I was hoping to see for anxiety. So, yeah, where do you go?
Yeah. Yeah, I think mood, the experience of a happier mood and the experience of less anxiety are two totally different things. And I think of very different plants.
Mm,
When I think of the experience of mood, I'm actually going to look towards some of those circulatory stimulants as well, things like ginkgo and rosemary to just get more blood flow up to the brain,
right.
alongside things like St. John's wort that boost serotonin levels. But in terms of anxiety, you're really wanting to look to these calming plants, everything from passion flower to kava to catnip and chamomile. And this is where I think the tradition of herbalism really shines, because traditionally, when folks didn't have labs and places where they could synthesize specific phytochemicals and understand what they were doing in the brain, all they had were patterns and observations. And so over time, our elders that developed the framework of traditional herbalism found that, hey, passion flower is really good for someone who has looping thoughts that keep repeating in their mind before bed. And they first kind of came to this conclusion by looking at that doctrine of signatures that I mentioned earlier, because the way that passion flower grows is it has all of these tiny tendrils and vines that tend to wrap around things. And
So
then
interesting.
people experience,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
when I have looping thoughts before bed that are kind of wrapping around my brain and can't stop, passion flower is giving me a lot of results. Then we have something like kava root that I mentioned. This is also really good for physical manifestations of anxiety. So it's a much stronger nervine than others, and it's going to have actually a physically relaxing effect. It's probably having a more pronounced effect on the vagus nerve. But essentially, this herb is really good for physical tension when your body is locked and tight when you're having anxiety. And it's also wonderful for performance anxiety. So if you're someone who's about to go give a speech or you're about to go play a musical instrument in front of an audience, I would take kava rather than taking passion flower. Then we have things like blue vervain. This is a very acrid, bitter nervine that helps a lot with tension that is in the shoulders and jaw. So they always say that blue vervine is great for perfectionists who tend to hold all of their tension right here in the jaw when things aren't going exactly their way. And then we have something like motherwort. And this is a nervine that helps when someone's anxiety is manifesting specifically as heart palpitations.
Mm.
So someone might be having anxiety concentrated specifically in the chest, burning in the chest, heart palpitations. And it's an herb that helps to impart courage spiritually and emotionally, especially when one is trying to set boundaries with other people.
You mentioned chamomile for people who, was it chamomile with stress manifests in their gut? But yeah, would love to hear more
Yep.
about what some of your top go-tos and corresponding observations indicating those go-tos are.
Yeah, so chamomile is certainly for someone whose stress centralizes to their stomach, where as soon as you're stressed out, it just feels like there's a rock in your stomach, and no matter what you eat, you're just not digesting it. Everything kind of shuts off down there. So chamomile is nice because it not only acts as an anxiolytic and helps with the stress-driven fight or flight factor behind that digestive experience, but it also acts as a bit of a digestive bitter, especially if you're
Mm,
doing a very long infusion and you're steeping that chamomile for a long time. The longer that it's in that tea bag in the hot water, the more bitter it becomes. So it's kind
right.
of like a 2-for-1 anti-anxiety, digestive bitter, super cheap, super easy remedy. And like I said earlier, my teacher, Claudia Keel, would say chamomile is for people who are crying on the outside. That's why it's really great for kids, really great for fussy children who are like, oh, my stomach hurts. Are we there yet? It's someone who
Mhm.
has no trouble voicing their concerns and is going to tell you and complain about how they're feeling, child or adult. Whereas something like catnip, which is also a lovely anti anxiety and even digestive herb, is for someone who's going to be sitting there feeling horrible, having digestive symptoms, but they're not going to tell you how they're feeling and they're going to keep it all inside. So
Right.
even just knowing that can help you kind of customize a digestive blend for someone or try out a tea for yourself.
So we've talked about a few different herbs. Do you have a way that you classify these? It can be a little bit challenging maybe because so many of these herbs have such broad action. but there do seem to be some categorizations we can use, sort of adrenal adaptogens, maybe things that improve mood. But how do you sort of frame these into a heuristic if someone's trying to wrap their mind about all these herbs and how we maybe draw circles around them?
Yeah, sure. So classically, in terms of herbal actions, we have things like bitters. That's one class of herbs. Bitters are these digestive focused plants that have highly bitter alkaloids within them, that when your bitter taste receptors on your tongue recognize the presence of these alkaloids, your vagus nerve is stimulated and your entire body receives this signal that it's time to secrete our digestive juices. And in response to intaking that bitter flavor through plants before meals, through a digestive bitters blend before meals, you are able to, from a top down, brain down level, produce more of your own hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes rather than needing to take an exogenous supplement of something like enzymes. Then we have things like, I guess today we'd call them nootropics. These would be herbs that improve cognitive function, improve brain function, memory, recall, things like that, through either A, exerting, again, a high antioxidant capacity within the setting of the actual neurons and the environment of the brain, but also help to increase blood flow peripherally in order to deliver more blood, oxygen, and nutrients to the actual brain tissue. So that's things like ginkgo biloba, bacopa, rosemary. They're kind of these circulatory stimulants that would be considered nootropics. We also have hepatic bitters that act on the liver and encourage phase 1 and 2 detoxification, and also act as cholagogues, which help to encourage us to secrete bile and also aid bile solubility so that we can break down fats better. And then we also have something like nervines. Nervines are one of my favorite classes of plants. These are anxiolytic, anti-anxiety herbs, essentially, that
Mm.
have a calming effect on the nervous system. And again, in a modern scientific lens, they're probably doing this through upregulating our production of calming neurotransmitters like GABA. Like you said, we have adaptogens. Adaptogens are these plants that help to bolster our non-specific resilience in the face of stress. And they're quite non-toxic. We take them in pretty large, multiple gram size doses because they are essentially food. They are often just the roots of plants and they are these food-like roots. So they're non-toxic. You take them in large doses. And what they're doing is they're helping your body to have a greater capacity to respond to physical and emotional demands. And they do this by acting on our HPA axis, which I'm sure you've talked about to a large extent, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which also involves other hormones. And what it's doing is helping this HPA axis to be less responsive to stressors and perhaps have less of an output of cortisol in the face of something that's stressing us out, or improve our endorphin levels through this HPA axis so that we already have a baseline greater perspective and approach to the stressors in our lives. And we're not too sure exactly how this works, but research is starting to come out showing that adaptogens, for example, can stimulate our heat shock proteins, which is the same phenomenon that's being seen when someone is entering a sauna. So they may be doing this through sort of like a hormetic stressor pathway, where when we enter a sauna and we have our body withstand a very high temperature that's knocking us out of homeostasis, we actually get a little bit stronger by having to temporarily adapt to that stressor of heat.
Right.
And so adaptogens may be doing this as well on a biochemical level, but they're also preventing immune suppression in the face of stress. So they're keeping our immune system functioning and healthy and responsive when we're overworked and undersleeping. They're also helping to protect our brain's neurons, for example, from stress because they have a very high antioxidant content. So they're going to help protect us from oxidative stress on a cellular level. And there's so many different ones. And this is where the personality of plants kind of gets to come in, where someone who is suited to something like Schizandra is going to be totally different from someone who's suited to something like rhodiola or ashwagandha.
So do you tend to prefer single ingredient? Because I know there's a lot of formulas that will have three, four, five, six different herbs, as opposed to you could do just eleuthero or rhodiola or whatever it is.
I think when you're dealing with the general population, blends are actually a lot more suited because you don't know someone's constitution, you don't know their energetic patterns, you don't know if they run hot or cold or dry or
Right.
damp. So having a very neutral blend of adaptogens, kind of an equal formulation of heating or warming adaptogens as well as cooling adaptogens, is the best way to make something that's palatable to the masses. So that's what I do in my line. I have an adaptogen formula, and it's kind of like the perfect energetic balance of a few different adaptogens so that we don't push the body in any one way. We just provide that overall antioxidant HPA axis support. But when you're working with someone one-on-one, it's actually fun to be able to customize a blend of adaptogens where you're maybe relying on 1 to 3 hyper-specific ones that really match their personality and their presentation. So for example, Schizandra is this adaptogen that when you taste it, it is a berry. It's like the 5-flavor berry, and it has all of these different flavors, but the predominant flavor of Schizandra is sort of sour and astringent. And anything that is like sour, tart, astringent is going to have this consolidating and tightening effect in the body. So whenever we see tissues in the body that are lax, if someone's struggling with leaky gut, we're going to maybe look to adaptogens that are astringing that can also help them on that gut-brain level. And then when someone is having more of these presentations in their personality or their way of being that a practitioner can notice through having a relationship with the patient, like their thoughts are kind of all over the place. Leaky thoughts is what one of my teachers would call it. Schizandra is this herb that kind of has this tightening effect even on the thoughts and the speech and helps someone to feel more concise and organized mentally. So it's a really interesting astringing effect where it goes beyond just the gut.
Awesome. Well, Olivia, I appreciate you taking the time, and it's been a really fun conversation. I think herbs, like we've been outlining, have so much potential to help people, and they're so available. They're so simple. So I would definitely encourage people to check out your work, do some experimentation, whether it be catnip, chamomile, whatever it is, and see if you can use these herbs that have been used for so long to help sort of fine tune your health. So just been great, and thank you again.
Thanks so much for the space to have the conversation.